Hello there and welcome back to another video. In my previous video, I used an Intel Arc A750 for 1 month to see whether or not it was any good. I won't go into depth about what my experience with the card was here because if you want to know about that, you'll just have to watch the other video. But the important thing is that this card absolutely rocks at video editing. But due to the way that the PCIe ports on my motherboard are laid out, I can only have one GPU. So what do you do when you have an extra graphics card that you bought but can't really use but also really like? That's right, spend just a little more money. Okay, maybe a little bit more than a little. All right, you know what, just spend all the money that you don't have and build a new computer for video editing. Perfect. That's right, today I'll be building a new computer that will become my video editing workstation using the A750 in combination with some other components that I've bought. So, how about we go over which ones I chose, shall we? First off, let's start with the next big boy component in the system, the CPU. I ended up going with the Intel Core i9-12900K. I went with this CPU because there was an incredible combo deal containing this CPU, a motherboard, and 32GB of DDR5 RAM for a mere $400. Do I even need to explain why I went with this CPU for this system now that you know what price I got it for? It's really a no-brainer. Anyways, 16 cores, 24 threads, a decent bit of cache, and this thing will just shred DaVinci Resolve because DaVinci Resolve does use a lot of CPU horsepower. I guess it only makes sense to mention what motherboard and RAM I got with this CPU in the combo next. I ended up with the MSI Pro Z690A Wi-Fi motherboard, which seems to be a pretty decent mid-range board. No complaints there. As for RAM, I got a kit of G.Skill Ripjaws S5, DDR5 6000 MHz CL36 RAM, two 16GB sticks of it, to be precise. Certainly not the fastest DDR5 ever created, but more than enough for what I'll be doing here. And what will be powering it all? Well, this is probably one of the more boring components of my build, nothing too unique or special here, just a Corsair RM850E. It's a tried and true power supply, good price, 80 plus gold, tier A unit, and there's really not too much else to say past that. Just a solid choice to get power to my components. Now, the 12900K is a pretty toasty chip, so what will I be doing to keep this cool? This was an interesting thing for me to think about, but I ended up settling on the Deepcool AK620 air cooler. Water cooling at the level that would make a meaningful difference here is just too expensive, and from what I've heard, the AK620 can take a 12900K at stock, so hopefully this cooler will be enough, especially if I undervolt the CPU like I plan to. On the topic of cooling, I also picked up a 5-pack of Arctic P12s. Not the PWM version, because I'm cheap and using voltage controlled fans doesn't seem to have a major disadvantage because my MSI board has voltage controllable headers. These fans should be nice and quiet and hopefully move enough air through my case to keep the CPU and GPU cool enough. Plus, they're super cheap at $6 a fan. And speaking of moving air through cases, which one did I decide to choose here? Well, this may be the most debated part of this build, but I went with the NZXT H5 Flow. I've always liked the way the NZXT cases look. This case fits everything I need to fit perfectly, it's got great airflow, and at $85, it's really not too pricey. And lastly, let's talk about storage. This was probably my favorite part of the build to figure out because I have a strange love for storage. I went with two SSDs in this build, a 500GB Western Digital SN770 as my Windows/Programs drive, and an SK Hynix Platinum P41 1TB SSD for my main editing drive. Since video editing can hit storage pretty hard, and each video project of mine can near 150GB, having a beefy editing drive is very important to me. Capacity wasn't too much a concern because no more than 2 projects should be on the drive at the same time. Once one gets completed, it's offloaded to my NAS, but having fast and durable storage for during the editing phase of the project is a must. With my component choices explained to you all, it's time to start assembling the computer. I'll start by taking the motherboard out of its box and then setting it on top of it as a nice little workstation to install some parts on. I like to start by installing the CPU in all of my builds. So I'll open the socket, ensure that there isn't any obvious damage to any of the pins inside of it, and then install the 12900K. I'm certain there will be a few people that are going to mention a contact frame for the CPU as they've proven to decrease temperatures. Although they are cheap and seem to be somewhat simple to install, I've chosen not to go with one for the time being. If temperatures get out of hand or anything odd comes of having the CPU installed without the contact frame, I'll pick one up and install it. With the CPU installed, I'll now move on to the RAM. This motherboard has a little diagram silk screened onto the PCB which demonstrates the correct slots to put the RAM in. So I'll follow that to make sure that I get proper dual channel. This is my first time handling DDR5 as well, and it's the same as any other generation of DIMM other than that it's actually really difficult to tell which way the module is keyed. The notch in the DIMM and the nub in the slot are so close to the center, it actually took me a moment to find the correct orientation. Just an interesting little observation I made while installing DDR5. At this point, I'd realized that I probably should have taken out the extra parts contained in the motherboard's box that I'd need for the rest of the build. These parts, in my case, included the I/O shield and some M.2 standoffs. However, other builds may need SATA cables, Wi-Fi antennas, or other things. So now it's time to install both of my M.2 SSDs, and I chose to do this in a bit of an unconventional order. Generally, everyone will put their boot SSD in the top slot for the best possible performance, as the top M.2 slot is generally connected to the CPU's PCIe lanes. However, neither of my drives have heat sinks, and I didn't want to spend any more money to get a separate one. Plus, my boot drive is only an SN770, which doesn't get very close to maxing out a PCIe Gen 4x4 link, so it's not like it'll benefit from the top slot. These two things led me to the decision to put the editing drive, my Platinum P41, into the top slot and the boot drive into another slot. My P41 is a much faster drive that should be able to benefit more from the direct CPU link, and it's the drive that will be hit the hardest, as editing can be quite tough on an SSD. This means that the heatsink on top of the top slot will benefit the P41 more than it would the SN70. And so in the end, I chose to put the P41 on top and the SN770 just below it. Funnily enough, because of the way that this system is configured, most of the main hardware components have been fully assembled now that I've got the CPU, RAM, and storage all installed onto the motherboard. There is still one thing that I can do to this board before moving into the case though, and that is to install the CPU cooler. Installing the CPU cooler at this time can be either a really smart decision or a really terrible one. Since my case has a fair bit of clearance around the top left corner of the motherboard, which is where the CPU power connectors are, installing the cooler, which will block a lot of that space, isn't a terrible issue. In more cramped cases, this can make plugging in your EPS power cable very difficult though. The main benefit to installing the CPU cooler right now is that it gives you a great handle to hold the motherboard by as you guide it into the case, and this is why I decided to install it now. This is my first time mounting one of these AK620s, and it wasn't a bad experience at all. I've used much more cumbersome CPU cooler mounting hardware than what's used on this cooler, so Deepcool did a pretty good job there. Thermal paste on these 12th generation and newer CPUs can be a bit of an interesting challenge due to the size and shape of their heat spreaders, and I just decided to put a pretty large and long glob of thermal paste in the middle, which should work just fine. And with that, it's finally time to move the entire motherboard assembly that I've been working on into the case. The first step being to install the I/O shield, as we wouldn't want to forget that. I then made sure to check that all of the case's pre-installed standoffs were in the right place and that this wouldn't give me any trouble. And after that was done, I finally put the board in. I don't have a good shot of it, but after setting the board in, which gets held in alignment by the center standoff's nub, I checked to make sure that none of the tabs on the I/O shield were inside any of the motherboard's ports. This is a surprisingly easy thing to do and can range from making it impossible to plug something in to just straight up shorting out a port, so take a moment to check this. Once the board was all screwed down, I decided to move on to installing the new case fans that I bought for this system. I don't have great footage of screwing the fans in because my small workspace was starting to become too crowded to get a good angle, so just bear with me here. I put 2 of the P12s I bought as exhaust fans in the back and rear top of the case. I then put 2 P12s as intakes in the front and replaced the stock NZXT fan that's in this case's cool little GPU fan duct with the last P12 of the kit. 3 intakes and 2 exhausts will give a pretty good amount of airflow with positive air pressure, so dust doesn't get sucked in from every little crevice. Oh, and I also made sure to clip the stock FK120 fans that come with the AK620 cooler back onto the cooler, as I left them off when I was originally installing everything. We're already at the final stretch of the build somehow. I hooked up a few fans, but in order to get everything hooked up nicely, it's kind of important to have the power supply cables in the case to route around. So let's install the power supply. This is the RM850E that I mentioned I chose earlier. 850 watts, 80 plus gold, A tier, and overall just a solid unit. 850 watts might be a little more than this system needs today, but with the way that computer component power draws are increasing these days, the thought is that this should be enough power for today and hopefully at least 1 month from now. As for the power cables that this system needs, it's quite bare bones. Motherboard power, 2 8-pin CPU power connectors, and some PCIe power for the GPU. The only cable I'll comment on is the PCIe power cable because I know there will be some people in the comments telling me I should never use a pigtail cable because it will instantly explode. The A750 is a card with a 225 watt TDP. In theory, it could use a singular 150 watt 8-pin and 75 watts of PCIe slot power to cover its power budget. The extra 6-pin connector really is not necessary, which is why the pigtail is the easiest, most elegant solution to power the card that has no drawback or safety concern associated with it. With the power supply installed and hooked up, only one component remains. The component that started it all, the Intel Arc A750 Limited Edition. Installing it was just like any other graphics card. Remove the correct PCIe slot covers, I messed that up the first time. Make sure that the PCIe slot lock is open, click it in, screw it down, and connect power. I didn't record myself hooking up any of the cables in this system because I was working on this at about 1 AM and really could not be bothered. In any case, I made sure that the viewable cables were managed beautifully, and then put no effort into the quality of the rear cable management. We'll just cover that up and forget that it looks like that back there for now. The moment of truth has finally arrived. Will I be staying up another hour troubleshooting, or will the system post and allow me to go to sleep? Well, thankfully, my tired brain was still functioning correctly tonight, which granted me the sweet, sweet success of a functioning system. We're done here, right? Well, actually not quite. There is one more thing that must be done before the system can be considered complete. There. Now it's fully assembled. Well, this is a video about building my editing PC, and I have to write these scripts before I edit the videos due to the way that my workflow works. So is there any way for me to tell you how it's been performing for video editing? Yes, there actually is. I will let editor me, who has edited up until this point using this new computer, talk about how it's been performing for just a little bit. Alright, it is editor me here. Hopefully the audio is not too bad. I don't have all my fancy EQ stuff set up on this computer yet, but I have edited the video up until this point. It's been absolutely awesome. This is probably the most responsive I've ever had DaVinci Resolve be, and a lot of that's probably due to the 12900K, but I know for a fact that it is definitely helped by the Intel Arc. It's just been real smooth getting to this point. Fans that I bought for this system. I don't have great footage of screwing the fans in because my small... It's been super easy to manipulate media, move it around, scrub through it. I mean, it's a little... Still fun. I've just loaded the project, so it's a little tired, but... It's awesome. And I'm really pleased with this system. It was worth every penny. And a bit of a side note, I have overclocked and undervolted the CPU at this point. I'm running 5.1 all-core on the P cores and 3.9 all-core on the E cores. And I have never seen something render Cinebench R23 as fast as this. It's not going to score that high because OBS is going and I've got other stuff open, but it's so quick. It generally scores more like 28,500 when I don't have other things open, but this thing is just awesome. I am super pleased with this computer, and it will be a great video editing workstation for me. Yeah, that is all that I have to say on it as editor me. Back to script writing me. I don't know what editor me just said because I can't see the future, but I'd assume that the system is doing pretty darn well. In any case, that's all that I have for today's video. I hope that you at least enjoyed it and maybe even learned a thing or two. I hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.